Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Taylor Dodson, and the study I conducted was on the effect of the Buteyko breathing technique on exercise recovery. As I've already mentioned, my name is Taylor Dodson. I am the sole researcher for the study, and I attend Bay School at Tunstall High School. I will be attending the University of Alabama in the fall, where I intend to major in kinesiology or exercise science. I chose this study because as a child I had severe asthma and I was always looking for little methods of relief instead of using my inhaler all the time. And later in the summer before junior year, I volunteered at Spectrum Physical Therapy, where I developed a passion for the field. And this all culminated to its peak when in junior year in research, I conducted research on stress management techniques, and specifically I identified the Buteyko breathing technique as a natural treatment for asthmatics. There's already been a need for research on exercise recovery techniques to improve cooldowns, and breathing techniques have been identified as a possible solution for this. Researchers have not yet conducted enough studies on the Buteyko breathing technique, and specifically teenagers have been underrepresented in all of the data. And this particular breathing technique has been identified as a lung calming and stress reducing technique, making this a potential solution for exercise recovery as a result. It's possible that the Buteyko breathing technique can improve shortness of breath through periods of breath control and breath retention, and it's hypothesized that the technique actually functions by reducing the carbon dioxide levels in the blood, which in turn improves the oxygenation levels in the blood. And as you can see in this picture, in the first little image at the top, you can see a muscle fissure or perfusion, and in the second half of the image, you can see that the oxygen in the blood has been able to repair that muscle. And additionally, there's been poor standardization of this technique, and in general, the Buteyko breathing technique needs more studies to improve on them. Some of these standardization barriers include the dependent variables such as FEV, FEV1, FEV, FVC, and these variables all measure something along the lines of the forceful exhalation of breath. The novelty of this technique has caused for poor standard administration procedures, so when conveying to participants the exact instructions of the technique, it can get very confusing. And Yang et al. Specifically describes some very poorly developed methodologies, which has made it difficult for researchers to base their research off of. The Buteyko breathing technique was most commonly considered as a non-traditional physical therapy intervention, and physicians believe that the Buteyko breathing technique can be implemented as a complementary therapy for many pulmonary disorders. And Bruton and Lewis specifically stated that it can be helpful for asthma, especially since it was designed for this, and they found that the Buteyko breathing technique improved respiratory rate and oxygenation, and additionally it could improve shortness of breath. So participants could often wean off their inhalers a little bit and get away from medication. And with studies on COPD, oxygenation and overall pulmonary function were found to be improved, and it was overall optimal when combining breathing techniques with exercise, which makes the potential for a study on this very hopeful. One research group notably conducted studies on pulmonary hypertension, and this group was Dodson et al. And they found that only the adult form of pulmonary hypertension had been studied, and teenagers often did not have any previously recorded data. And Gatter et al. Also improved upon this by saying that when practicing an exercise regime, that the rate of reoxygenation can vary, and there's a need to increase the rate of reoxygenation in order to promote muscle building, and this is enhanced by muscle perfusion. Additionally, pulse oximetry is vital to accurately measure oxygen saturation in these types of studies, and Mangelkock et al. Has specifically stated how there have been known inaccuracies with pulse oximeters. However, they suggested that there are several tips and techniques that can be used to improve their accuracy. These things include using certain fingers and laying the pulse oximeter flat on the table to get the best reading. Therefore, my primary research question for this study was, what is the effect of the Buteyko breathing technique on post-exercise oxygen saturation and heart rate in teenagers? And my research hypothesis was, if the Buteyko breathing technique is implemented, then there will be a decrease in heart rate and an increase in oxygen saturation after exercise. And my null hypothesis was, if the Buteyko breathing technique is implemented, then there will be no statistically significant difference in the recovery rate of oxygen saturation or heart rate after exercise. Throughout my experiment, the variable that I manipulated was the implementation of the Buteyko breathing technique, or the lack of administration of such. And for my dependent variable, I measured oxygen saturation and heart rate before and after 6-minute walk test, after treatment, and after recovery. My control was the group that rested instead of using this Buteyko breathing technique, and I tried to maintain the constants of the duration and the intensity of the exercise. And I also maintained the covering of the pulse oximeter to avoid variation. To complete my methodology, I first obtained a written consent form where the participants were informed of the mild risks of the study. I also received permission from Piedmont Governor's School and Dr. Jones, and I gathered 4 pulse oximeters from Governor's School, and I obtained 35 participants where I conducted 3 different trials at 3 different locations. First, I demonstrated how to do the Buteyko breathing technique, and I informed participants of the proceedings of the study. I also demonstrated how the 6-minute walk test would work, and then I measured their heart rate and oxygen saturation with the pulse oximeter, with the participants once again laying their finger on a flat surface and measuring their right index finger with the pulse oximeter covered under a piece of paper. After that, they were instructed to actually complete the 6-minute walk test, and immediately after the 6-minute walk test, they were remeasured for heart rate and oxygen saturation. Then the participants would either complete the Buteyko breathing technique for 1 minute or rest for 1 minute. Or after that, they would be remeasured again, recover for 5 minutes while sitting down, then be remeasured 1 more time. And lastly, I compiled my raw data and I conducted my statistical analysis. To analyze my data, I conducted a 2-sample t-test in order to compare the difference of the mean between the average heart rate and oxygen saturation from after exercise into 5 minutes of recovery. Next, within my test, my control group had a sample size of 13 and the testing group had a sample size of 15, and I conducted my data analysis accordingly. And I found that at the significance level of 0.05, the null hypothesis was not rejected with a p-value of 0.31 for heart rate, with a p-value of 0.40 for oxygen saturation. This chart helps to demonstrate some of this data that I recorded. Each dot represents an individual participant in the study, and each dot represents the heart rate from after they finish walking to when they finish resting. And the red is the control and blue is the testing. And these trend lines help compare the differences in the fluctuations of heart rate that you can see from the beginning after exercise to after recovery. And you can see the difference of how much it changed, and you can see that the control group did have a greater difference, so that would suggest a greater decrease. But since my study showed that it was not significant, the data does not support that the use of this technique results in such decrease. And once again, the dots here show the individual participants, with the red being the control and the blue being the testing, and the y-axis represents the difference in oxygen saturation after exercise into 5 minutes of recovery, from after they finished walking to when they finished resting. And these trend lines should help show the difference between the two. What I found particularly interesting about this graph was that in the testing group, you can see that the oxygen saturation difference from this is much closer in variation, and it was very consistent. Some interesting things about my study were, as I've already mentioned, that the oxygen saturation values were consistent in the testing group, and like in any study, I had several outliers. What's interesting about these outliers is that they showed that the participants did not actually exercise, and therefore I could not include them in my statistical analysis. And this was because their initial heart rate was higher than their heart rate after exercise. Overall, since my null hypothesis was not rejected, I do not recommend having the Buteyko breathing technique considered as a technique to enhance and improve exercise recovery rate. It would be better for athletes to simply sit down and rest as normal instead of doing this technique. However, I do believe there should be some further testing to confirm these results. Due to my results, I can conclude that the Buteyko breathing technique was ineffective at decreasing heart rate and increasing oxygen saturation, and at this time, I don't think physical trainers should recommend this for athletes until there is further research. And in my experiment, there were several things I would like to point out that went very well in my study due to my literature review. So using the right, first of all, the tips from Mingelcock et al. For pulse oximeters went extremely well. So using the right index finger specifically and laying the pulse oximeter on a flat surface allowed for very accurate measurements, especially when I had difficulty with weather conditions, because often the participant's finger would get cold and this would cause errors in the measurement. So I would have to move to the middle finger and then to the thumb if that did not work as well. Another thing that I implemented on my own was a constant rotation. I would have one set of participants go out and complete the 6-minute walk test, while I would have another set of participants be informed of the proceedings of the study. I also had some special helpers with me that helped everything keep moving and steady. Overall, I think the way this experiment was designed was very successful. However, I think some glaring limitations will call for further research. These limitations include the standardization barriers that exist due to the nature of the instructions of the Buteyko breathing technique and the 6-minute walk test. In the Buteyko breathing technique, participants are instructed to hold their breath for as long as they can, exhale, then hold it twice as long as they did the first time. This is obviously an issue because how are you supposed to hold your breath for twice as long if you already held it for as long as you can? And for 6-minute walk tests, participants are instructed to walk as fast as they can for 6 minutes. And this is also subject to the individual because people interpret that at a different pace. Another issue was that participants simply failed to follow the instructions and failed to complete the technique or the 6-minute walk test properly due to that. One flaw in my experimental design was the number of measurements I took with the pulse oximeter, and it could have caused variations and fluctuations in heart rate and oxygen saturation. Lastly, due to the volunteering nature of my study, my sample size was somewhat small. Since my sample size was so small, future research should be conducted with a larger sample size. And research on the general understanding of the technique itself is absolutely necessary to any further studies on its effect. I would also recommend, if this study was replicated, to use an exercise that is not the 6-minute walk test. Conducting this experiment furthered my interest in kinesiology and physical therapy, and I learned to have lots of determination because this project was very long and strenuous. My favorite part of this experiment was that I was able to combine my background experience with asthma with my passion for physical therapy and science. And lastly, I learned that COPD articles make fantastic bedtime stories, and it will put you and whoever you read them to sleep very, very fast. I'd like to thank Ms. Long for guiding me through this long process of my literature review and my experiment. I'd like to thank Ms. Gravitt for assisting me through my statistical tests. I'd like to thank Ms. Kirby for providing the supervision for the trial on the track. I'd like to thank John Mills and Matthew Nose for being my special helpers throughout the experiment and letting everything run smoothly. I'd like to thank the staff at Mount Hermon Baptist Church for allowing me to use the gym for one of my trials. And I'd like to thank Dr. Jones and Dr. Bocock for their permission to conduct this study. And lastly, I'd like to thank all of the volunteers who participated in this study. Now, before I ask if you have any questions, I would like to guide you through the technique to give you a better understanding of how it functions. So you can continue sitting down and breathe according to the instructions. So first, you're going to inhale, hold your breath for as long as you think you can, and after you've done that, then you're going to exhale, breathe like normally for a couple seconds, inhale one more time, hold your breath for twice as long as you did the first time, and then exhale, and if you feel like it, you can repeat the cycle. Now, do you have any questions?
We were debating that question because we were talking about this
We had
before.
the same question. She can have it.
Yeah, I said first.
Okay, that's right.
And we were talking previously, I hadn't heard about the BPT previously, so I actually read your resources, well, not just that, but your resources. And I learned something because I was always taught the box breathing method. That's one of the things in the military they teach you, especially if you're going to do anything where you have to focus. And we were talking in military, it was 6 seconds, 6 seconds, hold, breathe it out for 6, and just keep continuing. Reduces stress, used it with students to reduce anxiety. How did you you said you came across this because you had asthma? Did you do this prior, or is it something you were just interested in because you had difficulties with that?
So Ms. Ashworth is asking how I came across this technique. And mainly it was because of junior year in research class when I conducted that research on my stress management techniques. So I specifically focused on breathing techniques. That was one of our options. And along the way, I saw this really cool breathing technique that I figured out was designed for asthmatics. So that's why I chose it. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so had you compared this method to the box breathing method? Are you familiar with box breathing method?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
So Ms. Martin asked if I've compared this technique to the box breathing method. And interestingly enough, that wasn't one method that was frequently mentioned in my sources. And when in comparison to the Buteyko breathing technique, it was often compared to the pursed lip breathing technique. But I do think if I were to replicate this study, that I would consider using the box breathing technique or the pursed lip breathing technique as well.
Okay, thank you.
In your research that you did and with the literature, did you see anything with connections and variability for participants that varied in age or gender?
Dr. South is asking, sorry, about any variations in age or gender. And the main reason that I chose specifically teenagers for this study was because I came across no data where they were represented. And so either they studied adults or they only studied small children. And interestingly enough, when I conducted my experiment, I separated males and females because I thought that it might cause some differences. And I didn't include it on my slides because it didn't address my general research question, but I did that to entertain myself. And there were some differences between the two. And I believe it was more effective, hypothetically, with my mean with the females.
Very cool, thank you.
Yes, ma'am. Mr. Taylor?
Yes, so you mentioned that if you were to do more study on this topic, you might well try a different exercise as opposed to the 6-minute walking test.
Mm-hmm.
Which exercises were you thinking?
So Mr. Taylor is asking which exercises I was thinking about if I were to replicate this study. And I hadn't given it a lot of thought. However, my main idea was that maybe running would be more effective because you're moving at a much faster pace, everyone's familiar with it, and I feel like it would be easy to standardize. However, I think several exercises could be beneficial in this type of study, but I would need to research it